Welcome to our show today. I'm Lou Graham, producer and graduate assistant for the Gorney Institute. With us, we have Dr. Russ McCullough, the founder of the Gorney Institute, and Wayne Angel Chair of Economics. We have Dr. Justin Clark, the Menard Family Professor of Philosophy and Ethics. We have Dr. Peter Jacobson, the Gorney Professor of Economic Education and Research. And finally, our graduate assistant-elect, Blossom Edlin.
All right, well, we're here today to kind of celebrate our 200th episode. It's hard to believe. I started doing 200 divided by 52. That's like approaching 4 years. So I've been a part of it the whole way. Justin then joined in, and now we have Peter for a solid, what has it been, 2 years now?
Yeah, 2 years of bad quality.
2 years of questionable service to the podcast. No, it's been great working with the three of us, and then we have interviews. So we have some guests in the audience. We're recording now at Ottawa University, and we invited people to come and just listen to us. We've done a few events like this, and it's been kind of fun to get audience questions and just kind of take things as they go. As part of our celebrating this 200th, I thought each of us could comment on maybe some of our previous favorite podcasts, and then we can put those in the show notes, and maybe people want to check those out. So Justin, you want to start on?
Sure. I have two favorites, but they are related. So the first one was one we did, I think, 2.5 years ago, and it was about changing our minds, where I asked everybody to bring in something that we had changed our minds about, and then explain why we changed our minds, like what the reasoning behind our change of position was. And I thought it was really fun to see what people had changed their minds on. But my favorite thing about it was how hard it was to get everybody to say the words, "I was wrong before, and I changed my mind." I should literally say, "No, say you were wrong." People would say, "Well, I don't think I was wrong. I just changed my mind."
Growing as individuals.
Yeah. And the other thing that was great about that podcast was, of course, that Peter wasn't there yet.
I was going to bring that up too.
And then my other favorite podcast was what we did at the beginning of this year when we made predictions for this year. So if you go back and look at those predictions, if we talk about being wrong, you will see that I made some predictions that were wildly wrong, right?
I think all of mine were right.
You also
we'll
wouldn't say you were wrong in the previous one. This is the pattern. Yeah,
I bet on the Packers, I remember that, so that was bad.
Oh, that's right, it was before the Super Bowl.
I bet on the Bengals, and that was a close one.
Hey, yeah, you almost made it.
So I think publicly making mistakes and owning up to them is really fun and important, and I think that it's good to model that for our students and stuff too. So those would be my two favorites for that reason.
All right, Peter, what about you?
Yeah, so I was actually just talking about this podcast a moment ago. Probably my favorite is the Philosophy of Mind series that we did actually relatively recently. And the reason is I've been growing up in sort of, I remember campaigning door to door when I was 4 or 5 years old. I've been doing politics my whole life. I'm exhausted with politics. Unfortunately, that's what people really care about when you're an economist. It's oh, what about this policy? What about that policy? And so even though a big part of being an economist and my earlier life was being involved in politics, I get tired of politics. What I prefer, and this is true, is I like to just be a contrarian. And it's really easy to be a contrarian when you're the dumbest person in the room. And so when we talk about philosophy, that's me, because I'm not a philosopher. And so I really like questioning certain orthodoxies. And when I don't know what the orthodoxies are, that's very easy. And so Justin will talk about philosophy of mind, and I'll ask a really basic question about philosophy, or try to show that a very well-accepted thing is wrong. And I usually mess up, because again, well-established orthodoxies are established for a reason. But there's more growing in that. I'd rather be the stupidest person in the room than the smartest person in the room, because there's a chance to grow.
Well, that teed me up nicely, because I work with two people that are sharper than me, and that's what I enjoy about doing the podcast in general. My favorite podcast, I think, was back to Russ Roberts, and this was before Peter's time. Justin and I were on it.
Yeah,
Nice.
And so he talks about Adam Smith, and I think it's the often misunderstood Adam Smith. It's something that I like to try to bring to the classroom, that it's not all about making money and wealth and income. And so we spent a lot of time in that podcast. He wrote a book called Why Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. And he talked about really what Adam Smith put forward was that humans want to be loved and to be lovely. And that was literally how it was. Like, we seek to be loved, so we want to do things to get, people's attention, and but also to be lovely, we want to be proud of our own self. And so we spent the first half of that, and then Russ Roberts is Jewish, and so we got to explore his faith and how that ties in with economics. We've also had a Nobel Prize winner, Vernon Smith, on the podcast many years ago, and that was a pretty awesome experience to have the Nobel laureate and talk about his faith in economics, and he's also an Adam Smith expert. So those are some of the favorite ones I've had. I loved doing the philosophy ones too, the trolley problem and free will and all of that stuff, and we look forward to doing more of those episodes in the upcoming year as well. So.
Yeah, I think that's what I would have liked to have been a part of. I was an undergrad teacher of mine who first introduced me
Oh,
to
you
that.
had him for?
No.
Oh.
An undergraduate professor of mine first introduced me to that fact that if you look at Adam Smith, it's like one section of the entire book, Wealth of Nations, is about the invisible hands. And then Adam Smith has another book that's basically the same size called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. I mean, there wasn't a such thing as an economist when Adam Smith was around. There wasn't even economics, there was political economy. And so Adam Smith is a philosopher. You could even say a political philosopher. People often misunderstand economics as this narrow thing that only has to do with wealth and money, like you pointed out.
Yeah, we're more on the humanomics side. So I hope that listeners get that through the podcast, and my students get it in the classroom, that it's a lot more than maximizing GDP and maximizing income or utility, that there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on in economics.
Well, not more than maximizing utility.
All right, well, that's kind of a quick rundown. Let's go ahead and turn towards the crowd here and see if we've got an opening question. All right, Dr. Bill Sutsui here at Ottawa University. I know we're going to get clobbered here. That should be good.
Well, I just want to congratulate you all at the Institute for the series. 200 episodes is pretty phenomenal. It may just mean you all have a lot of hot air in you, but hopefully you'll expend some more of it on my question for you. Not surprisingly, I want to ask you about higher education. So ever since I've been in the academy, we have had a crisis in higher education, right? Things are getting worse. The economics is moving against us. The business model is broken, and we expect waves of college closures over the coming years. And yet, while there have been hard times for higher ed, it has always found a way to bounce back. There's a recent book out by the president of Temple University in Philadelphia, a guy named Jason Wingard, called The College Devaluation Crisis. And in that he makes the argument that the main crisis facing higher ed today is not demographics, which we've talked a lot about. It's not student debt and all those associated issues. It's the fact that people just don't believe a college degree is worth it anymore. And I wanted to hear about your opinions on that. Perhaps not your opinions as professors at a liberal arts Christian university, but as economists. Is a college degree worth it? And if it is or isn't, how does this relate to changes in the economy that we see going ahead? Is this a temporary phenomenon that will change in a recession, say, that's coming, or are we looking at a fundamental sea change in the value of higher education in the American economy? And Wingard argues that we are, and that higher education has to adapt significantly to this new reality.
Okay, well, I think education is something I, of course, am involved with as a profession, but also just interested in overall for society. And I think we really went wrong with the focus of education, that it was gotta get a degree, and we really lost the education part of it somewhere along the line. And this has been a slow burn over time, that we have the teach to the test, no child left behind, et cetera, where you're really losing focus on, is the student getting educated, or are we just moving them through the process? And I think it's finally catching up with us, and I think, God bless the market system, we're starting to see bubbling up of counter to that. So 40, 50 years ago, the education system was primarily controlled by the government through our K through 12 system, and then of course even our private nonprofit university has an element of control from the federal government because everybody's got their student loans. And so if you want to go to this school and have a student loan, then this school has to meet a certain amount of criteria. And so there's still influence that direction that pushes some of these, I think, unnecessary get a degree and jump this hurdle and meet this standard. And so it's a slow process that I think is finally coming to roost. And so some of these private alternatives of the online education, I think Khan Academy was one of the early pioneers of you can learn some useful skills, and maybe employers will start to find some of that useful, and then other places have gotten into certifications, and then Milton Friedman many moons ago talked about having a school choice so that students didn't have to go to the school they were designated because of where they live. And so ultimately the charter school system has been evolved, and that's been an ongoing experiment with successes and failures in some cases. More successes than failures, by the way, if you look at the data. But I think it's important to say it's good that we had a few failures, because that's what the market system does. It's not so much a profit system where everything's always going to be rosy, but the important part is if a school emerges that's not doing the right thing and they fail, they go out of business, that's great. So in some ways we should celebrate that there is both successes and failures in some of those more market experiments of having education come in a different way.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I want to highlight one of the things, Bill, that you mentioned, which is that I think humans in general have a tendency to really be pulled into pessimism very easily. And so it seems like every industry you're ever in is always in crisis all the time, and like just around the corner is the end. We talked about this actually before on the podcast. Well, the only thing in the entire world, if you track long-run trends, that is becoming more scarce, and by more scarce I mean the price of it is going up over time, is human skills. It's the only thing. It's the only good or service that's had sustained growth in price for more than a decade. That's wages, right? You look at wages. Oil, no sustained increase. We have fluctuations, but it's basically more or less the same as it was 50 years ago. Other natural resources, copper, you name it, these are all the same, energy. So upper education or higher education, flaws or not, something that it's doing is increasing the value, according to most of the people on the market, of human beings. I think that's certainly true, or the value of their services, rather. On the other hand, I think we are starting to recognize some of the shortcomings of recent upper education, and so I think my favorite example of this is what's called the sheepskin effect. That is, you could have, we can imagine an engineering major who finishes 117 college credit hours, and maybe the course that they're short is like they could take, let's imagine I took Exploring the Universe once in undergrad as one of my courses. And so let's imagine this engineer misses Exploring the Universe, they decide not to finish, and then track that person's wages. Well, what we find is that people who finish that course are rewarded a significant amount in wages compared to people who don't finish that course. In other words, a person 3 credit hours short gets rewarded like way more than just 3 credit hours worth of value. And so there's something weird that our society values actually getting the degree rather than the courses or the knowledge itself necessarily. So the degree itself has a weird value attached to it. And I think that there is some over formality associated with this. Whether it came from higher education or industry is kind of unclear. But if you look back, I was looking at history of Ottawa University, things used to be a lot more informal in a certain sense for taking courses. The requirements were a lot less clear. You know, it's not like each course had a syllabus. There wasn't this ABC standard. There was a lot of pass-fail oral examinations. I think maybe industry has pushed us in the direction of wanting very formal standards, but I think what we're going to find is more informal standards are going to be more important. So maybe degrees are going to end, is my final answer, but I don't think upper education will. I don't think college will end. I'd actually like to see a world where more people come to Ottawa University for a few classes, right? People in the Ottawa area who want to learn something. I think that's higher education working well, is when you're not just pursuing the end, you're pursuing education itself as the end. And that looks like, I think, a less rigid set of requirements being fulfilled. If that makes sense.
I agree with Peter that people are naturally pessimistic, and I also think that academia selects for a kind of neuroticism. It doesn't surprise me that academics, we often hear from other academics that the house is crumbling, right? But one thing that actually surprised me, and I think in a positive way, about the pandemic was that I think before the pandemic we heard a lot of things like, online education is going to just take over higher ed, and things like MOOCs or whatever, right?
Yeah.
These are the future, and you can just get certified online. And then the pandemic hit, and we tried that. Everybody tried that. And the collective response to that was, this is terrible, right? So it seems to me that there is a big demand, both on the teaching side and the student side, for in-person learning in classes of around 25 people. And I actually didn't foresee that as much. It was a welcome surprise to me. So that makes me think that some of the forces that are supposedly going to destroy the university, that there's actually some demand for the kind of services that traditional universities provide, maybe in a way that I didn't see before the pandemic. So.
All right, well, believe it or not, time flies. This looks like a good spot to take our break. I had one thing to say maybe after break on the sheepskin effect. I'm not sure that the degree part isn't all bad as a signal in the economy, where we get a lot of benefit from not knowing and knowing each other well. We can still have a lot of harmony, and so that degree helps signal that. I don't think it's always rich enough, right? And so, we'll just I love pushing back on Peter and see what he comes back, but we'll let Peter respond to that and a few more questions after we get back from our break. We'll see you in a bit. Okay, recording stopped. So what's the deal? Is the room double booked? All right, so we're back, and I had to comment that maybe this degree business isn't all bad, especially if there's substance behind the degree. That's kind of what we're getting at. And I just wanted to bring up, in a commercial society, we do use signals to try to make the market more efficient. So imagine Ottawa University is trying to hire a new position, and one of the ways we filter through 1,000 applications, I don't think we usually get 1,000, but let's just say some jobs do have 1,000 applications, is a sorting mechanism to say there's got to be a good pile. If half of these have undergraduate degrees and the other half don't, I might be overlooking some good people and that don't have an undergrad degree, but there's got to be a good one in this 500 of undergrad degrees. And so it acts as a sorting mechanism and a way for people to signal that, hey, at least I made it through to a degree. Now, if that degree is a crackerjack degree, then that's another story, but I don't know. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, so Brian Kaplan has his book, The Case Against Education is the name of the book, very provocatively titled. And his argument is this, that the sheepskin effect signals some sort of conformity, that you're willing to step through the hoops that other people are willing to step through, or you're willing to commit to it, signal something about you. I think that's fine to want those things, but I also think just in general as a society, we actually overvalue conformity pretty significantly, and we undervalue sort of weird, different approaches. This is me being biased because, for example, I homeschool my kids, and we're not going to do, math, English, science, social studies, history. That's not going to be the way that we do it.
So you're leaving them shortchanged.
Or I'm teaching them the way that they should be taught. So, I agree that markets are good sorting mechanisms, but that doesn't mean I have to personally like everything that market selects. And I do think that we're missing out on individuality a little bit and replacing it with conformity because of what because of the market demands.
And I think that's where the market hopefully helps, is that if there's deficiencies with the signaling thing that I just described with the degree, new innovations, new technologies are coming that I can signal it through my certificate that I earned with Microsoft or whatever. These alternatives emerge as equivalents to that sorting thing, and then employers start saying, okay, well, we'll take the degree, and now we're going to enlarge the pile to those who have Microsoft certificates also, right? That'll be an equal way to get into the hiring pool, so.
Are you guys going to take another question?
You're right, it is that time. All right, Lynn, what do you have for us?
Well, we're changing course. Peter, you mentioned before the overlap of politics and economics. And you, not all economics really have a faith piece, but certainly the Gordon Institute does. So I'm moving to, does separation of church and state even exist anymore? Certainly, I don't really want to get into the Roe versus Wade, but obviously it was highlighted there. And then specifically in Kansas with Amendment 2, it seemed like the faith card was played quite a bit on what was supposed to be a constitutional amendment. If you guys would comment on that.
You want to take the lead on that one? We did do an episode not too long ago related to this, and so we'll put that episode in the show notes because we spent 30 minutes kind of tackling a lot of those issues. But
Yeah, so I have maybe kind of a weird take on this in modern society. I was reading recently, I don't know if you call him philosopher, Max Stirner, who was like an old anarchist thinker. And Max Stirner, even in the 1800s, was pointing out the fact that he believes that basically all value systems are essentially religious value systems. And so at the time he was pointing to a movement amongst intellectuals in France, for example, away from traditional Christianity. But the scholar he was commenting on said something like, well, we can move from love of God to love of man, and we can keep the love part. And what Stirner points out is, well, then you really haven't fundamentally changed the religion, you've just changed the deity. So I actually am a little bit heterodox in that I'm not sure I believe in a separation of church and state, like in a true sense. Not that I'm against it, but that I don't know that it can exist. Because I think that church is a lot less narrow than just like we profess belief in God. I think there's lots of religions out there that don't claim to be religions. I don't really believe in unbelief, I guess is what I'm saying. And so I'm not too keen on the idea of separation of church and state being used in a traditional sense, because I think that what it's really saying is certain religions are allowed to participate and other religions aren't. And it really just depends on whether or not you're willing to say, I believe in a God or not. So that's kind of my take on it, is I'm kind of a skeptic of whether or not we can have it.
I think we need our philosopher to weigh in on this one.
If by separation of church and state we mean the strict claim that the state doesn't endorse or prohibit any particular religious institution or church, then I think it's certainly possible to have separation of church and state, right? And then, to talk about an issue like Proposition, whatever the number 2 is, it Proposition 2? Or Amendment 2, or the Roe issue. I mean, when I teach the ethics of abortion in basic issues in philosophy, we go over abortion as a practical ethical problem. Actually, I teach it in ethics and society. The arguments for or against abortion, on neither side do they depend on religious claims. It's an ethical issue. So, and there are very good ethical arguments on both sides of this issue. So I don't see this as an issue of separation of church and state. I think it's an issue about competing value systems trying to take over the state. And here's where I agree with Peter. I don't think you can ever separate politics from value systems, because that's exactly what political systems do. So insofar as we as a country have competing value systems, there are going to be huge political fights over those things. But if we want to separate church and state in the narrow, specified way that the Constitution states that we shouldn't, endorse or prohibit any religions, that's certainly possible. But I do think that that separation between church and state, that isn't going to solve our ethical dilemmas because we're still going to have to slug those out.
Yeah, I might just add on for those listeners who aren't in Kansas. So we had a pretty big vote, and there was an amendment to apparently the Constitution currently allows for abortion, and pretty much in flavor, I think, with the way it's been in the United States with Roe v. Wade. And so the amendment was to put restrictions on that, at least open the door for some restrictions to be placed. And that failed by a large majority. And so to me, it spoke that my old major professor said there's nothing harder to change than the status quo. And I think we saw some of that, because I'm sure, people did come out to vote. It was a good turnout. Hey, if it's this way, it's this way. I think what'll be different is that with Kansas having other surrounding states that are prohibiting abortion, we're going to see growth, I think, of abortion clinics, and abortions in Kansas is inevitable. And I think we'll see how the public feels about that if we end up being kind of a destination, because we are in the Midwest where a lot of states are prohibiting it. I think that's going to be a natural outcome of that policy change. Kayla, what do you got for us?
Okay, so I know for a while we saw, obviously we've seen gas prices double and close to triple at some points, it seems like, just on my wallet. But now we're seeing them consistently drop. I was just wondering if there was anything you can kind of correlate it to as to why it's dropping all of a sudden, because I just saw it continue to rise for a while. But.
So, since I'm being looked at now, here's my explanation of everything that's happened. Supply chain issues are obviously a part of this, but I think the two biggest drivers actually aren't supply chain issues. The first driver of gas prices, I think, had to do with the fact that the amount of money, like dollar bills and dollars in bank accounts in the United States has increased by 30% since January 2020. We printed a lot of money. And when you print money, that money goes to different people. It's usually like banks. And when banks have excess money, they lend it out more often. And so it goes into people's pockets. And then when people have more money from their loans from banks, they spend that money, right? And so if you print a lot of money, you're going to have more spending. More spending is going to push prices up. That's basically what I think is going on across the economy. Again, a little bit disproportionate because of supply chain issues, so gas is affected more than other things. But a lot of people will say, well, gas prices are increasing other prices. I don't think that's true. I think it's actually exactly the opposite, that the demand for goods is increasing gas prices. As far as coming back down, there's a pretty basic rule in economics that I think explains this, called the second law of demand. And the second law of demand basically says that as time goes by, it becomes cheaper to find substitutes for goods. And so when gas prices spike up initially, let's say you're about to go on vacation, it's really costly for you to make new vacation plans if you're about to leave and gas prices like doubled. But if you have a vacation at the end of the summer, you can do something else, like have a staycation, or maybe delay your vacation, or maybe have a vacation at a shorter distance away that you don't have to drive as far, or cancel your RV trip and take a plane instead. And so over time, it becomes easier to substitute for gas, and so demand falls. And so we had an increase in demand driven by new money, and now we have a decrease in demand driven by people substituting away from gas because it's so expensive. This is what happened to my family. We had a vacation booked, we drove all around, basically from here to the eastern half of the US and back, visited a lot of people. And that happened basically just as gas prices were rising, so we really got hit by that. But we had already made the plans, we had RSVP'd for a wedding. There was no real way to get out of it. But now we're looking at vacations next year, and we're saying, okay, we're going to do something a little bit closer to home. So.
Yeah, I'd add that I think there was a lot of pent-up demand from COVID, and there was also a large increase in national savings. So people actually had saving rates that were higher. So they were sitting on their own personal money on top of what Peter mentioned of there being an injection of money. And so those two things, I think, led to a lot of travel, and it's like, okay, gas prices are what they are. And it continued to increase demand. When I went on our 4th of July trip, I kind of felt like everybody was having this last hurrah, and like we kind of knew the economy was teetering a little bit, and now we've seen a reduction in demand, finding other substitutes as well, but maybe a general reduction, and that has caused these gas prices to go down. I think there's also supply response. I mean, gas is pretty profitable, and so those people who have gas supplies were doing everything to get more gas on the market, and so an increase in supply, I think, contributed a little bit to those falling prices. So falling demand and an increase in supply probably brings us to where we're at today, which isn't too bad at what, I say too bad relative to where we were, but yeah, maybe $1 cheaper than what
Hey,
we were.
that's a
That's
big difference
significant.
for a lot of people.
And it's also significant on those who have lower incomes. So one of the things that we like to say in economics is that this is a very regressive tax. The poor get hit harder with that price increase than the rich, because gasoline as a fraction of their budget makes up a lot more of their budget. Imagine if you're spending $5,000 on gas a year and you're only making $20,000, that's a quarter of your budget. So it hits you harder when we have these effects. And so policies that tend to lead towards higher gas prices will disproportionately hit those with lower incomes as opposed to those with higher incomes. Okay, Luke, what do you got for somebody online?
Yeah, we had a question submitted, and it was basically just wanting to see your guys' opinion on cryptocurrency and the rise and fall of that right now, the utility of it.
Oh, I think Justin might need to jump on that one. He's our cryptocurrency expert.
I've been a big fan of Bitcoin since like 2013. So I know I've also been through, I think now, 4 of these big spike in declines. I remember when it went from $60 to $130, and then back down to like 20, and then I remember when it went from when it broke 1,000 for the first time, and then when it went on the run from 1,000 to 20,000, and then on the run from 20,000 to 67,000, and each time it has retraced to its previous kind of height. So it's the graph itself is really fractal. If you look at it, you can see the same kind of shape happening over and over again. So if the question is posed in a sense that is this crash? Is it all crashing down? I think there are a bunch of projects that get killed off in every single one of these crashes, and I think that's great, because I think that the crypto space is a space that is full of scams and what's called vaporware, which are projects that are just have a paper behind them, but there's no real tech there. And it's similar to the way that the Wild West was extremely profitable, but there were a lot of cheaters out there, right? And so in each of these expansions and contractions, good projects survive. And so I have a few projects that I'm very, very bullish on, like Bitcoin and Urbit, and then a bunch of ones that I think, I'm watching them die, and I think that that's good. It reminds me kind of like I grew up surfing, and sometimes when a big set comes in and you're paddling, and you can duck dive, and then you can make it through the other side, and you can see like, oh, a bunch of other people didn't make it, right? And so I view these market crashes as big sets that come through and just kind of wipe out some of the projects that I think aren't particularly valuable.
Warren Buffett has a quote that says, we're all having fun swimming out in the ocean when the tide's in, and then when the tide goes out, we see who's skinny dipping. And that is, I think, a little bit about what you're describing here, and it is a healthy process. With Bitcoin, I have a long position of Bitcoin, so there's a book called The Bitcoin Standard that's a great introduction, and it should hopefully shed light on why every Bitcoin under the sun that comes up should not be jumping in price and people jumping on the bandwagon. The fundamentals of how money works, Bitcoin is it in terms of some of the properties that we'd expect money to have. Right now, it's not money though. Money is anything generally accepted as a medium of exchange, and Bitcoin's not there. It's very speculative at this point, especially with these wild swings in value. But a prediction I made 2 years ago was that by 2030, Bitcoin would become money. I think it'll stabilize. I think people will have an understanding of the bomb-proof nature of it, and it will be much more stable and used as money in some capacity. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but.
Yeah, so the one thing that I think is maybe a little different, Justin, in the recent spike and fall, that I don't think has been encountered much before, is the recent fall of Bitcoin, I think has a lot to do with the recent fall in a lot of financial assets. And so I like Bitcoin and what it is fundamentally, but I think the market spike to like 67,000 or wherever it went was fueled at least in part by the Federal Reserve money again that has flooded the system. That's true of, by the way, all assets. Whenever you pump new money into the economy, which is what we tried to do when coronavirus happened, again, January 2020 is when we really started, and it spiked up. The reason we do that is to stimulate investment. That's the reason the Federal Reserve, they say that's the goal. And this leads to investment in all sorts of things. Real estate is really common, financial markets, and I think in this last run here, cryptocurrency. I think a lot of the push into cryptocurrency was actually by a lot of hedge funds jumping in. You kind of saw this over the last time. And I think that jumping in, it was fueled at least in part again by lower interest rates on loans from banks being fueled by new money. So I think unfortunately for the asset, it got caught up in kind of we'll say an easy money generated bubble, kind of like we saw with the housing market in 08 and 09, and honestly maybe today. Hopefully not, but maybe. And so there was a little bit of that. That doesn't change any of the fundamentals. It doesn't change the fact that it could be good, but it also isn't immune from the same things that other financial assets can experience in terms of risk and malinvestment and things like that, which I don't think you would claim otherwise either. But that's kind of the one thing. As it becomes more adopted, it runs into more of the problems that other assets have.
All right, well, believe it or not, we're out of time already for this 200th episode. I'd like to thank the people who came today and those who participated online. Thank you very much for helping us celebrate. So this has been a production of the Gortney Institute here at Ottawa University. I'd like to thank you all for listening. The 5-star rating helps other people find us. Otherwise, be sure to forward along to your friends and family. We're on all the major podcast apps. Other than that, be fruitful and multiply. Thanks.